Today I'm gonna take you through a full week of typical Swedish dinners. So this will be a combination of classical husmanskost, which would quite literally translate as houseman's diet. We probably could be a little bit more gender inclusive there. And these are meals with an emphasis on simple ingredients and simple preparations. They are hearty and comforting, and most of them very easy to throw together weeknight dinners. And alongside these more classic staples, we will also have a few more modern additions. That is, if by modern you mean things that were introduced in the 1970s to 1990s. As someone born in the early 1990s, I sure hope that the 90s is somewhat considered modern times. Then again, you speak to the average 19-year-old and they always seem shook when you're announcing your birth year. Like, before the 2000s? It's a very humbling experience. And of course, these meals will all be prepared vegan. If you watched a couple of my videos before, you might recognize this dish. Pyttipanna, or small pieces in a pan. This is traditionally a way to use up any leftovers that you might have, and thus you can throw just about anything in the pan. So long as it's in small pieces, of course, because we are not making giant pieces in a pan here. That is an entirely different dish. But this is a great way to cook if you're about to do a little fridge clear out. Although, full disclaimer, this dish is so popular with Swedes that these days you can just buy a ready diced frozen bag of pyttipanna, ready to pour into the pan at your convenience. So the world is really your oyster here. But typically for pyttipanna you would include at least diced potatoes, some onion and some form of ham or sausages. We are going for a mix of potatoes, carrots, some cabbage, onion and then some tempeh bacon today. Because this includes quite a lot of chopping, I prepped this the night before. So to make the tempeh bacon, I marinated it in a mix of soy sauce, olive oil, some agave syrup and some smoked paprika, and then proceeded to dice the veggies. The tinier the pieces you make, the faster this will cook. When you're ready to eat, we will start off by frying the potatoes, carrots and cabbage, so the veggies that have sort of a similar density, and then we will add the onion into this. This is then served with some pickled beetroot as a side. Absolutely delicious for a very simple and budget-friendly meal. Now this next one you probably wouldn't associate with Swedish cuisine, but this is in fact a pretty popular staple and school lunch. Chili con carne, or chili sin carne in our case. I think the reason chili con carne has grown to be so popular is the fact that it lends itself very well to our cooler climate. It's a simple yet nourishing and warming dish. It's also very budget friendly as you can bulk it out with beans, and it's an easy thing to batch prep and have over several days. So for this one we are going to saute an onion, some garlic and some red chili. I didn't want to buy a whole bag of chilies just for one meal, so I'm using dried chili flakes instead. And then to this we will add a mix of oregano, thyme, cayenne pepper, cumin and some tomato puree. Letting this cook off for about half a minute and then adding in our soy mince. The recipe that I followed suggested using red wine, but again, I wanted to keep this simpler using stuff that I already had at home. So I opted for some veggie broth and a splash of balsamic vinegar instead. And then we will also need a can of tomatoes. Then we'll leave this mixture to simmer for at least half an hour. The longer the better, just to allow the flavors to develop. And then we add 2 cans worth of beans. I went for chickpeas and borlotti. I also decided to throw in the rest of a butternut squash that will be featured in an upcoming recipe. We'll leave this to cook for another 5 minutes and then we can serve it over a bed of rice. On to one of these dishes heavily associated with Swedish cuisine, the humble meatball. But with these accompaniments, I feel like this is a meal fit enough for royalty. This dish would traditionally be served with lingonberry jam, like many other Swedish dishes, but it's not something I've managed to come across this side of the North Sea. But what we can make is pressgurka, or pressed cucumber, I guess, using my trusted osthyvel, kind of like a cheese slicer, which we love to claim to be a Swedish invention, but it is in fact a Norwegian one. I had never made pressgurka before this week, but holy moly am I glad that I did. It is so simple and it lends itself really, really well to this dish. Having this as a side cuts out a bit of the richness from the meatballs and the cream sauce that we will be making. We will also be having some potatoes. You may be familiar with hasselback potatoes or hasselbacking. That is cutting a potato into a fan of thin slices, creating what can only be described as roast potato divinity. Crispy on the outside, tender in the middle, all round delicious. But you may not know that this technique is said to originate at restaurant Hasselbacken in Stockholm. Once you have hasselbackat all your potatoes, we will cover them in some olive oil and then roast them in the oven at 225 degrees for about 20 minutes. And then we will quickly take them out, add some vegan butter on top of the potatoes, and then we are going to pour a very generous amount of breadcrumbs on top. And then we will pop this back in the oven for another 25 minutes until they've gotten a nice and crispy surface. Whilst the potatoes are roasting, we can remove the excess liquid that we've pressed out of the cucumber. And then we will add the cucumber slices to a container with a lid, pour over the dressing that we made earlier, consisting of salt, cider vinegar, some sugar, and white pepper. We'll give this a good shake and then leave it to sit in the fridge for about half an hour before serving. Our final step is to fry off the meatballs as per package instruction. I'm using the Tesco Plant Kitchen variety. And then into the same pan, we will make a quick little cream sauce. For this one, we will combine some oat cream, some vegetable stock powder, a bit of soy sauce, some dried bits of thyme, and salt and pepper. You could also add some juniper berries and some blackcurrant gel into this. I couldn't find, or rather, I couldn't be bothered sourcing either of these ingredients because I'm not a particularly big fan of blackcurrant jam, jelly, whatever you call it. But the sauce was absolutely delicious with the ingredients that I did have. And as Pippi Longstocking famously said, man tager vad man haver, which is sort of my motto when it comes to cooking anyway. Per tradition, Thursdays in Sweden are heavily associated with eating pea soup. This is something that has lived on since back when we were Catholic in the Middle Ages, when Fridays were typically a day for fasting. So on Thursdays you would typically have a more hearty meal. This tradition has prevailed throughout the Reformation, and this can apparently also be somewhat accredited to the military, who used to provide pea soup as a cheap and nutritious staple food. Since around the 1800s, the pea soup has also been accompanied by the addition of pancakes as a sort of sweet dessert. Today we're making a bit more of a modern take on the pea soup, adding some different spices, and we'll also be using frozen green peas instead of the split variety, just to keep things a bit more quick and simple and delicious. Swedish pancakes are very similar to a crepe in size, with almost like a lace lining of crispiness around the edges. We are making ours with only 4 ingredients today. Aquafaba, so the liquid from a can of white beans, some plain flour, salt, and soy milk. Oh, and then there's butter. As much butter as your conscience will allow. I'm having my pancakes with some sugar and also some hjortronsylt or cloudberry jam. I bought this jar last time I went to IKEA, but at home we would typically just pick these berries ourselves. These berries are related to raspberries, but they grow in much damper conditions. So you would typically need your Wellington boots as you're walking through these very wet mosses. And you might also want to wear like a mosquito fishing net hat, because this terrain is also very popular for these giant flesh-eating flies called brems. It's a whole thing, but it's all worth it for these very, very delicious berries. So you may have heard of Taco Tuesdays, but not in Sweden. We have it on a Friday, Tacofredag. This is somewhat of a modern tradition, popularized I would say around the early noughties. I'm guessing it's to do with a very successful advertising campaign by a company called Santa Maria. They do sort of Tex-Mex inspired dishes. So for me as a millennial, this was very much a thing growing up. I think the beauty of Taco Friday is the fact that it's relatively simple to throw together, and it can also be quite a social feat. With there being so many things to chop up, everyone can get involved. And as an added bonus, it can be quite child-friendly as well, as everyone gets to pick and choose what they would like to include on their plates. Taco Friday is also part of Fredagsmys, which is like Cozy Friday, where we will get some snacks and relax after the working week with the family in front of the TV. When I was a kid, this would include watching shows like Fort Boyard or Gladiatorerna, which I am so happy that there is a UK reboot of these days. Me and my boyfriend watch it religiously, and it is just as exciting as it was 20 odd years ago. Anyway, for this Taco Friday, I started by finely chopping some cucumber, some tomatoes, some lettuce and a red onion. I then made this very simple guacamole with some of the red onion, some garlic, lime juice, salt, white pepper and chili flakes. I then roasted and blitzed some sweet corn to use in another röra, or dip, I guess you would call it. This one with a bit of vegan mayo, some salt, coriander and pickled jalapenos. Finally, I cooked the soy mince with the rest of the red onion and this homemade taco seasoning, which is in fact very inexpensive to make. And then it's just a matter of piling everything together on a tortilla wrap, hoping and praying that you'll be able to close it due to the overflow of goodness. Next up, we've got another not traditionally Swedish dish, but rather an adaptation of the classic Russian dish beef stroganoff. The Swedish adaptation is not only more budget-friendly, typically using sausages instead of beef, but it also has a lot more of a simple flavor profile, mainly relying on onion and tomato puree as the prominent ones, whereas beef stroganoff typically uses more umami-dominant flavors like mustard and mushrooms. Korv stroganoff, which is sausage stroganoff, was first introduced in Sweden as a school lunch in the 1950s, and since then it quickly became a household staple. Although we are making yet another adaptation today, pumpkin stroganoff, with the addition of sambal och elek. I'm guessing the Swedes must be particularly big fans of sambal, seeing as Swedish is one of the languages listed as part of this product's nutrition and ingredients label, which surprised me a little bit because it's not something you see every day. So we are simply going to roast the butternut squash with some tomatoes and red onion. And whilst that is roasting, we will make the stroganoff base. Starting off by gently frying some tomato puree and garlic, then adding some mustard and sambal, some vegetable stock powder and oat cream. And then we will leave this to simmer for about 10 minutes, then adding the roasted veggies and seasoning with some salt and pepper. This is a super simple, creamy and decadent meal. You could easily throw some lentils or a can of white beans in there as well to make it a little bit more substantial. Like the rest of the world, we too have a take on a dumpling. For our final recipe of the week, we are making palt, also known as pitepalt, which is a potato dumpling traditionally filled with pork, but we are using mushrooms. Palt is very much associated with the northern parts of Sweden, which is my neck of the woods. I mean that in a very literal sense. Whereas the southern equivalent is called kroppkakor. The main difference between the two is that palt uses grated raw potatoes, whereas kroppkakor are made from cooked potatoes. This makes the northern version a lot denser. For this one, we will finally grate some raw potatoes, adding these to a big bowl with some salt and wheat flour. Apparently you're meant to squeeze out the excess potato water before you add in the salt and the wheat flour, and this way you don't have to add quite as much flour to get a good consistency. I asked my mom and she said she normally leaves the water in, and then I also watched a video of like the battle of palt versus kroppkakor, and the lady making palt would also typically leave the potato water in, but then she was told by a professional chef to squeeze it out. But anyway, we've got the dough, and then we will shape this into balls roughly the size of a tennis ball. You will then create a dent in the middle using your thumb. Into this dent we'll put a bit of mushroom mix, and then we will pop these into a big pot of boiling water. I don't have a big pot, so I'm basically using my entire lineup of pots here. And then we will cook these until they rise to the surface. It's kind of like making gnocchi, only it takes about 30 to 40 minutes for these guys to actually rise out of the water. Then normally you would have these straight out of the pan, cut them in half, fill the dent created with some butter, and serve this with a side of, you guessed it, lingonberries. We didn't have time to eat these fresh because we already had dinner plans for the evening, so instead the next day I just cut them up and fried them in some butter. And then we had these with another batch of the tempeh bacon as a side and the leftover mushroom mix. So that is everything for today. I hope you enjoy this little insight into a typical Swedish diet. I'm actually feeling a little bit homesick now after making all of these very nostalgic dinners. Also, I just wanted to say a special thanks to Gustav Johansson. He's the creator of the website Jävligt Gott, which he has been running for well over a decade, and he has done so much work in veganizing a lot of these very classic Swedish dishes. If you've enjoyed this video, please feel free to give it a like, and if you'd like to see some more typical Swedish dishes, please let me know in the comments. And as always, thank you so much for watching.